Western governments are sort of primed to sort of think about the people who want to participate in jihad, maybe fly off to Syria, participate, and then come back. But what people are not necessarily paying attention to is those who maybe can't afford the ticket, but are at home. And they say that there's a clear connection, not organizational, but an inspiration between men such as Nidal Malik Hassan, the U.S. Army psychiatrist who shot 13 people dead in Fort Hood in 2009, the Tsarnaev brothers who planted improvised bombs in the Boston Marathon last year, killing 2, the British soldier Lee Rigby, who was killed on the streets of London by 2 knife bullets, etc. So there are people who may not be actualized, but may still act in these ways.
The man who used a machete in a New York subway. The guy in North Carolina who goes after 3 people over a parking space. The people who gather together and kill journalists and people inside a supermarket. The phrase most commonly used for such attacks are lone wolves. And it's becoming more apparent every single time we experience such an event that the phrase itself may be a misnomer and might even be misleading. Our guest is a leading expert on the world of extremism, an award-winning journalist on the subject, also senior fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Let's welcome Mark Potok into MidPoint. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Mark, let's start out with the study that you folks did at the center and tell us exactly what you found briefly about lone wolves.
Well, let me say, first of all, we were looking only at domestic incidents, domestic terrorists, that is, homegrown American terrorists, with targets in the United States. So we were not looking at, for instance, jihadists who go to Syria or al-Qaeda plots that originate elsewhere directed at the United States. What we did was we looked at 63 different incidents over the last 6 years, more or less the period that Barack Obama has been in office. And we found that an enormous majority of them were people acting entirely on their own, 74% of the attacks. When you looked at those, when you added in those attacks in which there were just 2 people involved without any kind of help from another group or direction or other people involved, the total came to 90%. That really has been a long-running trend within the country, and you're beginning to see it among a lot of jihadists as well. As really you mentioned in your introduction, people who are essentially radicalized over the internet or in other ways, but act on their own.
Mark, let's go ahead and look at that, though, because when we look at the lone wolf concept, there is still a thinking process that, wait a minute now, maybe these are people who are using terror as an excuse. They use religion as an excuse. That these are frankly nothing more than a bunch of whack jobs, just people out there who are looking for a reason to justify what they've done. And when people think of lone wolf, they immediately think of somebody who is at the core of some sort of terrorist operation. Now, whether that's reality or media fairy tale, you will have to admit that's what immediately people think about. So what about separating those who are nothing more than just common criminals out looking for a way to create a crime and kill somebody?
Well, I think there may be something to that. You think of the Aurora, Colorado theater being shot up. I mean, the shooter seems to have been quite insane. And I will also give you that many of these people are at least partly mentally ill. I don't think there's much doubt about it. I think, for instance, about the guy who some years ago flew an airplane into an IRS building in Austin. He was somebody who was quite insane. But at the same time, he was somebody who had been influenced by various tax protest groups. And then there are people who are, I think, not mentally ill. They are certainly, incredibly terrible people. But think of Timothy McVeigh. I, as a reporter, covered the McVeigh trial and the Oklahoma City bombing, of course. And McVeigh, I don't think there's any sign that he was mentally ill. He was quite an intelligent guy. But at the end of the day, he managed to murder 168 people.
But are we overthinking some of the influence, perhaps, of these jihadists in prison and also possibly the people who are out there, the posse comitatus, if you will, and others who are out there? Do we just sometimes, maybe even in the media, overstate this and overstretch it just to fit some sort of a narrative?
Well, I don't know about trying to fit a narrative. I think that, human beings naturally look for reasons that things happen and are dissatisfied with, being told that there's no explanation at all. Look, I mean, the same could be said of jihadists. Undoubtedly, many of the people who have traveled to Syria from the United States, from European countries, have major problems in their own lives that have nothing to do with some interpretation of Islam or hatred of Christianity or the West or whatever it may be. So, it seems to me that motives inevitably in virtually all criminal matters are somewhat mixed and hard to disentangle. But that does not, I don't think, give us license to say that ideology plays no part in these kinds of things.
All right. Now, what you're saying right there, I think, is at the core of this here, because it would seem that many times, for instance, even in the North Carolina case, let's be very frank here, there has been no proof to this point that it was a hate crime. There is an indication, perhaps, but it has not been proven. Yet you will agree with me that many of the media immediately jumped on this as a hate crime. Some people even talked about a lone wolf here looking for Muslims to kill. We still seem to have this knee-jerk, if you will, to where if it happens, if it seems to be terror, that we immediately want to attach it to some sort of radical belief. Isn't that in itself just incorrect? Because if you're going to figure out the lone wolf, you got to figure out where they are. Are they just a lone wolf nut job or a lone wolf out here doing something for a cause?
Well, the fact is we don't know.
Right.
In North Carolina, there have been various reports. Of course, the police initially said they thought it was essentially a parking dispute. But there is also some evidence that the man may have had real animus towards the women, in particular, wearing hijabs. Another more recent case came up on Friday in Houston when an Islamic center, one building in an Islamic center and school, was burned to the ground. They've now arrested the man who allegedly carried it out. He was a homeless man. What the police said initially was simply that he had used an accelerant and deliberately carried out this arson. Again, there was a lot of speculation. Was this an attack on Muslims because they were Muslims? Or was it, essentially kind of crazy homeless guy who wound up setting fire to this building for whatever reason? Well, this morning he was in court. And there is evidence that the authorities there have found that he, after the arson, went to a convenience store clerk across the street and started to talk about how much he hated Muslims and how these people who had their building burned down deserved it.
Yeah, I want to point out that
all I'm saying is that there is ideology involved in many of these acts, although I'm not trying to claim that they are all 100% political.
Absolutely not.
About, for instance,
I wanted to point out, I'm all out of time, Mark, one sec, but I did want to point out that in the report you said, and this is quote, while jihadism is a deadly serious concern, the report shows that authorities should not focus on it to the exclusion of other threats. That, I think, is something that people need to take away from this. Again, it's the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's on the website. I really would advise everybody to read it. Mark Potok, thank you so much for sharing this with us. We appreciate your time. And MidPoint will continue.